Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this lesson on the three branches of United States government. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and me and the squirrel are very, very excited to be sharing this information with you, so hold on to your hats, and here we go. Let's start with a very basic breakdown of what the three branches are. We have branch number one, that's the legislative, they make the laws. Branch number two, that's the executive, and they carry out the laws. And then judicial branch, that's branch number three, and they evaluate the laws. The legislative is made up of a bicameral Congress, that is two houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The executive is made up of the president, along with the vice president and the cabinet. We'll get into more detail about that in a few minutes. And the judicial branch is primarily the Supreme Court and also other federal courts below it. I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing with you the concepts of separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, it's important that you understand that checks and balances are the ability of each branch to check the other and stop the other from doing something that's bad. So effectively, this check that each branch has on all the other branches allows a balance of power to develop. But the founders didn't want to stop there. No, they wanted to double up on everything. So they also included this idea of separation of power, and they divided up the powers of the government among the three branches to make sure that no one branch had all the power. This was to avoid what's called a concentration of power. So, how does this work? Well, let's take a look at the executive branch first. Okay, so the executive branch has checks both on the legislative and the judicial branch. Okay, now the executive can propose laws, it can veto laws, it can call special sessions of Congress in an emergency, president makes appointments, and also negotiates foreign treaties. Now, on the judicial branch, the president nominates federal judges and can grant pardons to offenders, criminals of federal offenses. In the legislative branch, they can check both the executive and the judicial. The legislative branch can override the presidential veto if you get a 2/3 or supermajority in both houses of Congress. Now, the president's veto doesn't matter. The bill becomes law anyway. They have to confirm all appointments, so the president can nominate, but if the Senate does not confirm, then that person does not become the position that the president wanted them to become. The Senate also ratifies treaties, so a president can sign a treaty, but it only becomes official if the Senate ratifies it. Only Congress can declare war. This is a very, very common misconception that the president declares war. No, 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 no. Only Congress can do that. The president can send troops, but only for a certain time. It's Congress that really controls that. The Congress appropriates money, and they can also impeach and remove the president. Now, for the judicial branch, the legislative branch was in charge of actually creating the court system. So they create the lower federal courts. They can impeach and remove judges. They can propose amendments to the Constitution to overrule judicial decisions, and they can approve appointments of federal judges. As far as the judicial branch, they can declare executive actions unconstitutional, so that's how they check the executive branch, and they can check the legislative branch by declaring acts of Congress unconstitutional. Now, I have this lovely little visual down here that I want to bring up. This might make it a little bit easier to see for those of you visual learners. You can really get a good sense of where things go and how they work with the arrows going back and forth. So that's a basic breakdown of the separation of powers and checks and balances of the three branches of government. So the legislative branch is also known as the People's Branch. It was considered the most important branch by the founders because it was the branch closest to the people. Now, there are a couple different types of powers that the legislative branch has. Expressed powers, sometimes also called enumerated powers, are powers specifically delegated or given to the Congress. They are directly stated in the Constitution. Now, there's this thing called the Elastic Clause, also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, that allows Congress to make any laws that are necessary and proper that they need to make in order to carry out their duties. This idea is known as implied powers. So Congress, at this point, has a few more powers than they originally started out with because they needed to have these things in order to carry out the expressed powers. So, what exactly are the express powers? Well, you see them right over here in this little chart. There are peacetime powers and there are also wartime powers. So some of the major, most important ones, being able to establish and collect taxes, borrowing money, regulating foreign and interstate commerce or business, economic exchange, naturalization, becoming a citizen, and bankruptcy laws. They get to make the money, or coin the money rather, to create the money. They establish post offices. They created the court system in the United States. So there's a lot of different powers they have. Another important power is the power to declare war. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the president does not have the power to declare war. He can't do that. Only the Congress can. So all of these powers are what are delegated, specifically expressed, granted to the legislative branch. We need to discuss the important differences between the House and the Senate. Now, what's important to note about Congress is that it is bicameral, okay? That means there are two houses of Congress. House number one being the House of Representatives, and House two is the Senate. Let's start with the House of Representatives first. It is larger. It has a total of 435 members. The House has what's called proportional representation, which means it is based on population. So the larger a population a state has, the more representatives it has in the House. It is a shorter electoral cycle, and each representative is elected to a 2-year term. It is a very narrow constituency because each state is divided into tons of different districts based on population. So, as a House of Representatives member, you are running for election in a very small area of one state. So that's called a narrow constituency or a small constituency. It is considered to be less prestigious because there's so many more members. And what's important to note about the House of Representatives is all revenue bills must start in the House. If they don't start in the House, they can't become law. So all bills that deal with revenue have to originate in the House of Representatives. They have to start there. They tend to be less reliant on their staff, and the power structure is based on committees. Now, the Senate has committees too, but the committees are not as important in the Senate, not nearly as much as they are in the House, and I'll talk about the committee structure on the next slide. The Senate is much smaller. It has only 100 members, and the Senate has equal representation, and there are 2 senators per state. There is a longer electoral cycle. Each senator is elected to a 6-year term. They have a very broad constituency because instead of running for a small district within one state, they are running across the entire state. Okay? It is considered more prestigious because there's fewer of them. Now, their key powers that they do, they ratify treaties and they confirm presidential nominees. That's important. They are more reliant on their staff, and power is more evenly distributed. Let's talk committees. Now, as I said in the previous slide, the House power structure is largely driven by committees, not as much in the Senate, but it is important to note that both the House and Senate have committees. These committees are necessary to break up the duties and the administrative concerns that have to be done. Like, for example, proposing laws. If people were just proposing laws willy-nilly, nothing would ever get done. So there are committees in place to help organize the business of Congress. So there are 4 main types of committees. There's a standing committee, select committees, joint committees, and conference committees. The most important committees in both houses of Congress are standing committees. And if you look over here to this graphic on your right-hand side, these committees are permanent congressional committees responsible for considering legislation, holding hearings, supervising policy, research, and overseeing executive branch agencies. Standing committees are the most powerful type in Congress. Now, the one exception to this is in the House of Representatives. The House has what is called the House Rules Committee. Now, the Rules Committee in the House of Representatives determines how, when a bill is going to be debated. So they get to deal with scheduling debates. They deal with deciding the rules of debate and how this process is going to move forward. So if you're sitting on the House Rules Committee, you are one of the most powerful people in the House of Representatives. Now, as you can see in this graphic down here, there are several different standing committees that are there all the time. All right, and these committees are responsible for helping us operate the daily business of government. Select committees are formed in a special circumstance, like when the Benghazi situation occurred. There was a select committee formed on Benghazi. When 9/11 happened, there was a select committee formed about 9/11. They are temporary committees designed to deal with a specific problem or to address a crisis. A joint committee is a committee comprised of both House and Senate members. Okay, so joint committees have both Democrats and Republicans and members of two different houses. Conference committees are also comprised of members of both houses of Congress, and the purpose of these committees are to reconcile differences between a bill. So if the House produces one bill and then they send it to the Senate and the Senate marks it up and does all kinds of crazy things with it and then sends it back to the House, what will happen is that a conference committee will be formed and members of both the House and Senate will put together a bill that will then be debated and voted on in both houses. So instead of having to have the House debate and then send it to the Senate and then the Senate debate and send it back and then this back and forth, instead you have a conference committee which allows just one version of the bill to be sent to both houses for a vote. As we said before, the executive branch is in charge of executing the laws. Now, there are four major parts to the executive branch. There's the office of the president himself. There's the cabinet, the set of advisors to the president and heads of the bureaucracy, the executive agencies, and independent or regulatory agencies. We won't go into details about those right now. I'll focus on those as the subject of a later lesson. For now, let's talk about what the president can do. Okay, the president can negotiate treaties, meet with foreign leaders, recommend legislation to Congress, sign into law bills passed by Congress. If he doesn't like those bills, he can also veto those bills by Congress or disapprove them. He can grant pardons, and he can send troops overseas. That power is limited, however. The president can only send troops for a total of 90 days. If Congress does not declare war, then the troops have to come home. All right, the president can only have troops out and about for more than 90 days with the approval of Congress. The founders did this on purpose. Now, subject to congressional approval, the president can sign treaties, appoint ambassadors, appoint justices to the Supreme Court, and appoint cabinet heads. Now, as you can see, or as I hope you're deducing, the legislative branch has a lot more power than the executive. The founders did this on purpose because they just overthrew a tyrannical crazy man king and they did not want to have the same problem at home. So they purposely gave more power to the legislative branch rather than to the executive. The judicial branch is very important because it's in charge of determining if the laws are constitutional or not. They have to judge those laws based on the Constitution. This power is called judicial review. Okay, it's the ability of the courts to declare a law unconstitutional, and this power was first used in Marbury v. Madison in 1803. It's a very, very important Supreme Court case which we will talk about in class. But I just want to give you a big picture breakdown of the structure of the court system. So at the very top, we have the Supreme Court. And a case doesn't just go to the Supreme Court in the vast majority of instances. What happens is it has to start somewhere else first. Usually it starts in one of these three places, okay? Most of the cases that we hear about start within the district courts, and then they have to make their way up through the courts of appeals, and then if the Supreme Court decides to take it, then it winds up being argued in front of the Supreme Court. Let me give you a little bit more detailed diagram of how this works. So let me make this guy bigger that's down here, okay? You have a lot of different courts floating around here. Now, you don't need to understand or know all of them right now, but just to give you an overview, the court system is not just the Supreme Court, all right? The judicial branch contains the Supreme Court and all the federal courts underneath it. Now, state courts operate in a very similar structure, but they are the purview or the propriety of the states themselves. Okay, the federal court system, the national judicial branch, you're looking at it. This whole big breakdown of different appeals courts and different trial courts. And we will talk more about these courts in a later lesson. But I wanted you to understand the basic breakdown that it's not just the Supreme Court, it's also the hundreds of federal courts underneath it. So what did we learn? We learned that there are three branches of government. There's a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. We learned that legislative makes laws, approves presidential appointments, that there are 2 senators from each state, which is equal representation, and the number of congressmen is based on population, which is called proportional representation. We learned the executive signs laws. They can also veto laws. President pardons people, appoints federal judges, and is elected every 4 years. All right, the judicial branch decides if laws are unconstitutional. That process is called judicial review. They are appointed by a president but confirmed by the Senate. There are a total of 9 justices, and they can overturn rulings by all other judges. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.